our session today, because I do know there's people who are wanting to be here who could not make it at this time, is what we were just talking about. So welcome to our session tonight. I am Carolyn Cunningham, and I'm one of the directors of the Northwest Alliance for Media Literacy. And our organization is really trying to raise awareness about media literacy in our community. And so a lot of the things that we do is educational. We do panel discussions, we do teacher training, we have curriculum and a speakers bureau. So we do a lot of things to really raise awareness about media literacy. And we're at a pretty important time, I think, in our history where we're just seeing the importance of media literacy. We know that a lot of public schools do not have curriculum in media literacy, although one push in Washington State is really to fund media literacy curriculum and education. And that's something that we also are really passionate and excited about. So if you're interested in our organization, you can find us through Facebook, also on the web, and we can, I think if you just do a search for Northwest Alliance for Media Literacy, you'll find us on the web, and you can also see some of our upcoming things as well there. And I also wanted to do a shout out to Gonzaga School of Leadership Studies, who is also a co-sponsor of this event. School of Leadership Studies has 3 graduate programs, one in communication and leadership, where I am actually a faculty member. We have a program in organizational leadership and a doctoral program in leadership studies. So they are also sponsoring this event, and we are also really engaged with community outreach. So tonight we are calling this Facts Not Fear, and we have as our guest Arjun Moorthy, who is the CEO and co-founder of the Factual. So he is here to talk with us a little bit about news bias and news literacy in a lot of ways. I was reading his bio, and I've talked to him a couple of times, but he has a background in computer engineering, as well as an MBA from Stanford University. And he was also a past editor-in-chief of the Stanford Reporter. So I think he's always really been passionate about media and media literacy. And he'll talk a little bit more about his perspective and what he does. So I guess I'll turn it over to you, Arjun. Just before we do that, I just wanted to say we will have time for a question and answer at the end. So you can we're a small group, so you can either post it in the chat and I can gather some of those, or you can just ask a question as it comes to you after the presentation. So I'll turn it over to you, Arjun.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me here. I'm delighted to meet you all and share some of these insights and findings that we've had while building my startup, The Factual. So a very short deck ready for you guys here. And since we are a small group, it'd be great to make this very interactive. Please, as Caroline said, ask questions along the way. It's a heck of a lot more fun when we do that. So let me just share my screen and then we'll begin. Okay, great. Sounds like everyone can see my screen. Just a quick background on myself. Carolyn did a great job and explained some of the things, some of my background. Maybe some of the interesting parts that you're wondering why on earth I'm doing this. It's actually a corny story. My very first job, believe it or not, was a paper boy. And I was 12. I lived in Canada, and I fell in love with delivering the newspaper. I really thought it was the coolest job. I was proud of my paper out and getting people the news, and I would flip through the newspaper every day when I could, between sort of waiting for the papers to arrive. And I thought, yeah, I'd love to do something with this. And then later on, when I was at Stanford, I was the editor-in-chief of the Stanford Reporter, which was the publication for the business school. And that was also really fulfilling, and I quite enjoyed it. So I was definitely a big news geek growing up. I'm one of those people that had a subscription to the New Yorker when I was 19. Like I thought it was a cool magazine. And so when I finished grad school, and after a few years of working at HubSpot, which is a software company out of Boston, a very popular, really, really good company, I realized I wanted to do something close to my heart, and I saw that the news industry was really struggling. And being a very naive engineer, I thought, hey, I could do something about this. Let's throw some technology at it. And boy, was that a really ill-conceived extent of an idea at the time. But I met a really good co-founder called Ajoy, and both of us have been working on the Factual now for about 5 years. It was actually called Civic Owl when we started. We rebranded midway through, and it's been a hell of a journey. Very, very good, very fulfilling, and also very, very hard. So that's a little bit about me. I thought I'd start with something that most of us probably see every day, which is headlines. And I thought, if you were presented these two headlines, right now, sort of the biggest discussion in the news is about the infrastructure bill, or one of the biggest discussions about the Democrats' infrastructure bill. And these are two headlines that you may have seen. I'm curious, I don't know what the best way, since we're a small enough group, I mean, you guys can just put up your hands, I guess, or maybe just throw it in the chat pane. Which of you think this is sort of the, this is the best, which of those two headlines is the best? Sorry, let me just bring that back. Oh boy, sorry, give me a second. I lost my screen. There we go. Yeah. And so maybe Caroline, since you're manning the chat pane, you tell me, I don't know, what do you guys think? Number one or number two as being the more factual of the two, or neither?
We have one vote for the first one being more factual. Other votes?
I think the first one is the factual one, right?
Yep. First one from Zoe says first one. Other votes in here?
Yeah.
Okay, not bad. So far, two, is that right? For
we have 3 votes for the first one so far.
Okay.
I haven't scheduled my vote yet. I don't know if I'm voting no on the Democrats' plan or yes on the Democrats'
plan. Well, it certainly looks like we're leading towards the first. I think some of you are going to be surprised at where these came from. So the first headline's from Daily Wire, which is a well-known conservative news site, and the second from CNN, which a lot of people believe tends to lean left. What's interesting is that if you read enough about the infrastructure bill as it's happening right now, the reality is the future of that bill is quite uncertain. It's a really complex bill, and there's broad bipartisan support for some parts, what's called the Senate part of the infrastructure bill, and other parts less so. And so if you wanted a really factual headline, I think it might actually be this one, which is rather boring. It just doesn't, like, I mean, that's the truth. You don't know what's going to happen. And if you were really just trying to convey the news, you'd say, it's a big week. There's going to be a lot of mudslinging. There's going to be some pros and cons. That's as much as we can tell you. I don't know. And then, you know, as a contrast, you go back to this, Daily Wire seems like it's saying this bill is definitely passing. You don't need any Republicans. It's going to happen. And then CNN is almost saying the opposite, which is this GOP senator is definitely voting no. That sounds bad. It sounds like it's never going to pass. And if you step back and think, why would these two outlets do this? Well, the Daily Wire is probably pitching to its audience who's worried about this massive bill going through and the debt exploding and oh my God, what's going to happen to the future of our children? So they're using a little bit of fear here, saying there's nothing that you can stop this from happening. It's going to happen. And conversely, CNN's playing to its base, which is left-leaning, saying, you know, this plan is so dire to begin with, and now the GOP is uniformly saying they're not going to support it. It's DOA. It's just not going to happen. And so each of them are playing to their bases, using fear a little bit of knowing what they really fear. But the reality is no one actually knows the future. No one can really say what's going to happen. And about the best you can have is this really dull one from CBS. So I thought this was a really good example and very recent. And of course, this happens hundreds of times a day. It's happening on every topic you could think of. And so if you go to this chart from Knight Foundation, which shows how people's worries about news bias has really increased in the last 15 to 20 years. And now 83% of Americans say that they feel there's a great deal or a fair amount of political bias in news coverage. It's 4 out of 5 people and up from about 62%. So considerably, very, very high. And what's really interesting about this is, you think back to 2016 and fake news was the term of the year. I think Webster Dictionary or someone, maybe Britannica, said that was the term of the year. But for a lot of the cases, fake news isn't outright false news. It isn't news that's just wrong. It's more often news that's biased, and people think that just doesn't make sense. Oh dear, I did this again. And so it just doesn't sit with what I know to be true. And I think that there are facts that are being selected in this article. They're only some of the facts, or it's framed a certain way, or there's insufficient context.
You do.
Oh, sorry, did I miss someone? Yep. So, a lot of people would say that there's just not enough, that an article is presented with just some of the facts and not all of the facts. It's framed a certain way to lead you to a certain conclusion. And when people see that, they're like, this is not true. Then they go around screaming fake news, fake news. It's not that the article was wrong. It's just that it selectively omitted some things or didn't have a whole lot of facts behind it. It seemed to be guiding you in a certain way. And of course, this isn't just a print issue, right? If you think about, all of us probably have seen some video clip or audio clip in the last few years, and you thought, oh my God, that's so outrageous. Like, how could he or she say that? And then you discover a few days or weeks later that that clip was somewhat edited, and you didn't actually see what came right before or right after. And of course, this is again framing bias and selection bias. So this happens a lot of times, and where people really start to say that news, it's all fake news, but a lot of times it's really biased news. John, great question. Isn't there actual fake news? There's definitely outright false news, but at least in our research, it's far less prevalent than one might think. It's rare that people just make stuff up entirely. Sometimes, of course, but if you're talking about any news outlet that sort of is semi-reputable, even, and I say semi-reputable, like they're attempting to inform the public, it's rare. And so pick your favorite, I'm not talking pure tabloid nonsense like InfoWars, for example. I'm talking, whatever, New York Post, if you're not a fan of the New York Post, or CNN, if you're not a fan. It's rare that they would be just outright false. It's more likely that it would just be selected or slanted a certain way because they know what their audience is expecting. What's interesting here is not only are people, I don't have the second graph behind this, but not only are people saying there's a lot of biased news, it's not just saying it's on that other, like it's those people that are listening to the biased news, it's those guys on the other side of the political spectrum. Even people that are going to sources that they sort of believe pander to, or lean in their way, are starting to feel that the news panders to them. So for example, a lot of people, if you guys remember CNN probably 30 years ago, was pretty commonly referred to as like, the source. Especially I remember when I travel for work, every hotel, you'd always get CNN, the easiest channel to flip on. It was always English and you could find out what was going on. But even people that are longtime fans of CNN are starting to realize that it really does lean a certain way. And a lot of people, except for the extreme far left and extreme far right, don't want to be pandered to. Most people, when we've talked to them, would say, just give me the facts. I'm not dumb. I can make my own decisions. Don't pander. Don't like lead me down this road where I just feel like I'm being mollycoddled, if you will. So the problem of news bias is really, I think, front and center to what's when people say fake news. Now, what's interesting is this isn't a new phenomenon. So I found this article. This is the front of the New York Journal from 1895. So I'm going to go a little history here, but I thought it'd be fun. There was a ship called the USS Maine, pretty big destroyer, and it sailed from Florida to Cuba in 1895 to protect US interests in Cuba back when the Spanish were ruling there, and there was sort of some tension between Americans, Cubans, and Spanish. And 3 weeks after it sailed there, it mysteriously exploded and sank, and about 250 sailors died. It's a big deal. Now, the early reports from the military, the Navy, were this was an accident. It looks like there was a spontaneous combustion in the engine room, coal, that's what blew up. But the news did not run that. And this one, the New York Journal, which I think it's William Randolph Hearst and Pulitzer owned it. And then they ran headlines making it clear that this was the work of an enemy. And then I think the World Today, which is another one, ran something similar. It said, torpedo or mine, what could have done it? Very much insinuating that the Spanish were behind this. And this was, this really amped up the tension in the country. And it didn't lead directly to the Spanish Civil War, but it certainly was a factor in sort of the public feeling like, you can't trust those guys, something bad's going on there, we really need to get into it. And the Spanish Civil War happened soon after. So part of why I'm bringing this up is the problem of news bias is not new. This has been around as long as the papers have been. In fact, in earlier days, newspapers were actually quite blunt about which side they supported. There were clearly papers that supported the right side. I forget, I think it was called the Federalist Papers, but I'm not certain. It supported the Whigs, which are the precursor to the Republicans. And then there were papers that supported Democrats. It was very obvious and everyone knew it. And that was just sort of accepted. It's a relatively recent phenomenon that we think, well, the news should be perfectly neutral. The truth of the matter is it's almost impossible. And even when journalists do attempt to do it in good faith, and I do think a lot of them do attempt to be objective and report, the reality is that there's framing bias, selection bias, all kinds of bias, just by nature of what you chose to report on, how you chose to report on it, who you spoke to when you were interviewing to talk about it. Bias creeps in everywhere. It's endemic and has always been there. It's not really a new thing. Unless we think that this is an American issue, this has been around, it's in every country if you think about it. And this is a stat on declining trust in the news in the US versus the UK. And it's very much around President Trump's election. But what's interesting is in the UK, it's sort of unanimously declining, both the right and the left. And funnily enough, the left is actually a little less trusting than the right is. But it wasn't even precipitated just by Brexit. I mean, certainly Brexit made it worse, but it's sort of been there for a while. So the problem of bias, really, as long as newspapers have been there in any democracy, or probably even authoritarian regimes, news has always been viewed with a little degree of skepticism for those people who really are aware of the news. And that's really the right thing, because actually they have a history of being biased. There's not a reason to feel like they're gospel just because we're getting something from them. Another interesting historical chart, just in terms of, why does this matter so much? So trust in our government has been declining for a long time. In the 50s, we're right around 70%, very, very high. And then really right after that, if you look at sort of from 75 onward, it's been sub 50% ever since. And then on the right side, I was only able, I don't think Gallup has been asking this question long enough, but Americans' trust in mass media has declined from the mid 50s down to low 30s. And now I believe it's in the 20s. It somewhat parallels what's happened in the 90s onwards. But it's to say that when we distrust the news that we receive, it's not a surprise that we are also distrusting of our government. I don't know that I draw a causal relationship between these two. I'm just saying they tend to go together. You don't trust government, you tend not to trust the news that you get, and vice versa. So of course, this has greater ramifications. If you don't trust your government, if you don't trust the news that you're getting, it's hard to really build a strong community. It's hard to elect leaders that we trust, have decisions that we trust, move forward as a society. So when you don't trust the news you get, it becomes a very, very big deal, as possibly amplified by this issue. So I think for most people, you might be thinking, well, why is this happening? Why has it gotten worse in the last 20, 30 years? So right around 1975, as I said, trust went down. And you can see on this chart that right about 1975 is where advertising revenue started to really climb for news. And the two were actually right about 50-50. So news funded itself part through circulation, subscription revenue, part through ads, and then ads just exploded. And what happens with advertising, of course, none of this is news to you guys, but advertising is an attention business. You need to get people's attention. The reality of getting people's attention is you're going to skew towards headlines that are a little sensational, that are a little bombastic, because that's what gets people to pick up the paper and open it, or in today's world, to click on things. Many people may not know this, but when journalists write an article, they seldom get to write their own headlines. In today's day and age, most of the time, headlines are written by a combination of editors and marketers. It's extensively tested on social media to see which one gets the most likes and shares and things like that, and then they run with that. So you'll often see journalists actually complain and say, that headline doesn't even capture what I wrote, but it's kind of out of their hands. It goes a little bit to the business model of news. Now, advertising has fallen off a cliff in the last 10 years because of Google and Facebook really dominating the digital side. So now news organizations are once again learning to rebuild their subscriber base. But ad revenues are still the majority of revenue for nearly every publication that is subscription-based, except I think the New York Times is now more than 55% subscription. So New York Times is a very good example that's been able to turn the tide, but most people have not, and advertising revenue continues to be the biggest deal. So this may be one reason why you've seen a decline in trust in news and an increase of people feeling like bias has gotten a lot worse in the last 20, 30 years, because we are driven by ads for the most part in news. Now, the old formula for solving this problem, if you talk to folks sort of pre-internet era, was actually pretty simple. They would say, you know, I just read multiple newspapers. That was it. I remember when I was a kid, my dad always got 3 newspapers delivered to the house every day. And I remember asking him, I'm like, Dad, why do you get 3? And he said, well, you wouldn't just read one and trust it, would you? And that was my first understanding of, oh, actually, you should always read more than one perspective. You should always have more than one viewpoint. And that formula works pretty well, except if you look at this chart today, and you have thousands and thousands of sources, and they're all over the political spectrum, some moderate, some extreme, different varying levels of credibility. I mean, this chart is basically an eye chart, somewhat unreadable. And actually, it's quite popular online. People share this all the time as though it's like, well, here's my decoder, secret decoder ring. It's like, yeah, okay, who's really going to use this, on a day-to-day basis? This is nuts. So the simple formula of read, quote, both sides is really not very easy to do when you have thousands and thousands of sources that we have now. Moreover, the research actually shows that reading both sides is actually sometimes counterproductive. If you read extreme opinions on both sides, it turns out that psychologically, we tend to dig in our heels into what we already believe. Because what you're reading is so outlandish, you're like, what is this? No way, of course those guys are nuts. And you start to believe what you already believe more, and confirmation bias really takes over. So if you really want to follow the formula of reading different viewpoints, which is actually a good formula, you also need to make sure you're not reading something that's overly extreme, overly partisan, overly opinionated. That's when you get the benefit of multiple perspectives. It's not just saying, I read from the left to right. Like if you read CNN and Fox, which is typically considered sort of the formula, it actually might make you much more upset and much more partisan than if you actually took more moderate sort of viewpoints and read them. And so that's where this really becomes a difficult thing to solve in today's day and age. So, one of the formulas, if you will, for how to find objective news and avoid fake news was in this little infographic that I found from the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions. And it's just a little infographic. I thought it was nice, it was easy to understand. And they said things that are really sort of basic media literacy that we should all be practicing. So they said, first, consider the source. What do you know about the source? What are they about? How are they funded? Who's behind them, etc. Check the author. Is this author someone that's credible? Do they know what they're talking about? Have they written about this topic before? Are they something of an expert? Do they have supporting sources? What's the evidence cited? News is, after all, the discipline of evidence, facts and evidence. So what is their sources? Read beyond. Don't just look at the headlines. Look beyond it. Is it really loaded, the terminology or the language, or is it neutral and relatively objective? Check your own biases. Make sure that if you tend to lean a certain way, are you questioning your own confirmation biases so that you're finding different viewpoints? Ask the experts. Listen to people that really have studied this topic a lot. And if you do that, you're more likely to find better news. And so this rubric, I think, is a really good rubric if you want to just get the basics of how to spot credible news. And I think people that read a lot of news, we actually do a lot of this instinctively. There's a term actually called lateral reading, where you see an article and you immediately are like, if you're online, you open up multiple tabs. It's like, well, I'm going to check this, make sure I've got all these different angles. Okay, great. Now I'm good to go. I know that this is a site that's really good for this, blah, blah, blah. What we found is that this is a really good rubric, but for a lot of people, it's somewhat impractical to do on a daily basis. If you think about how most people get their news today, the truth is you get something in your Facebook feed, something in some other social media feed, something on your phone through alerts. You might get some newsletters, you might get some forwards and shares from friends and family. You've got news coming at you in all these different ways. And are you going to really apply this rubric each time? And it's like, hold on a minute there. Let me just check there. Who's that source? It's quite difficult to do this. So what we did at the Factual was to take this rubric and some of the ideas captured in it and really turn it into software and make it easy for people to evaluate these things in real time. Just have a little handy guide next to you that gave you a sense of if this was true or not, all of these guidelines from the International Federation of Library Associations. So I wanted to switch here to a very brief demo of the Factual and what we do and how we effectively make it easier to find credible news. But before I do that, let me just pause and see any other questions. I saw one from John before, but anything else I missed so far?
I was wondering, Arjun, I was really liking your point about actually, if you try to read both sides, it becomes counterproductive. That it's actually, if you're reading extremist kind of news, you just kind of stick in the trenches. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I thought that was a really important point.
Yeah, I need to dig up the actual research paper. It was cited in Nieman Lab, which is a big journalism sort of school. It's a joint partnership with Harvard. And yeah, this idea, they did this test where they show people sort of the CNN and Fox and see if their viewpoints on an issue had changed or softened up in a little bit. And they found that it actually wasn't. And so this very simplistic idea of reading both sides was actually counterproductive. It wasn't helping people expand their viewpoints at all. It was making things worse. But if you toned the rhetoric down a little bit, and a little bit like what the examples I picked with CNN and Daily Wire, which they're a little inflammatory, but actually they're not even the worst of the lot if you think about it. But if you read, articles from right and left-leaning publications that really take a measured approach, but frame it in the ways that you would expect. So for example, yesterday there was an oil spill off the coast of California. And as you might expect on a left-leaning publication, the framing would be largely around environmental issues. This is really bad for environment. Look at all these things that have happened. And if you read a right-leaning outlet, the framing might be on how quickly the spill was cleaned up, how much technology has really made this be a relative non-issue. By the way, if you think about all the offshore oil production that we have, how often does this happen? How does its risk and exposure compare to other forms of energy production and things like that? And the truth is you kind of need both to really understand the story. You do need to understand the environmental impact, which can extend far beyond what we maybe understand. So look back, what has happened to the Gulf of Mexico after a Horizon oil spill and all these? What has happened in the intervening 10 years? Has the ecology bounced back or not? Do we really understand what's going on? And then simultaneously, you do need to understand, like you can't just say all offshore oil drilling is bad. Well, we're going to get energy somehow. Every form has negative effects. How does this compare? How often does this happen? Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? All these kinds of things. And then as a consumer, you now have what it takes. But it's neither extreme headline. It's not like, you know, we should shut down all oil production from the left. And it's not like this is such a minuscule issue. Please, this is nowhere near like Exxon Valdez, like stop even talking about it. Actually, that's not correct either. And so it's somewhere in the middle, and it does take a little bit of getting those more moderate perspectives together.
Great, thank you.
Okay, great. So let me switch. Okay, sorry, I'm just gonna switch to my browser so that you guys can see the Factual in action. Oh, that's right. Sorry, give me 1 second. I'm just gonna pause my screen while I escape presentation mode and switch to this. Okay, so the first thing I want to show is a browser extension that the Factual has built, and it allows you to see the ratings of an article in real time as you browse. This was the very first product we built at the Factual. It was really sort of our ratings system, very much built along the lines of what the IFLA infographic had. And we wanted to make it easy for people to see this as they browse. So here's an article on the Pandora Papers at NPR. This was a huge headline yesterday, a big expose on how the very wealthy, mostly government officials, extremely rich folks, how they avoid taxation through offshore accounts and things like that. And so this is the Factual's extension over here, and it rates articles as soon as you load them up. It takes a few seconds usually, and it gives you a very simple red, yellow, green sort of traffic light system. And if you have a green article, it tends to be rated pretty highly and is relatively credible. It may still have framing bias, but it tends to be chock full of facts and written fairly informatively. Yellow is sort of moderate, and orange is saying we couldn't verify a lot of things on this one. Be a little cautious. It may still be a good article, but our system couldn't verify most of it, so proceed with caution. So if I click on this, you'll see a pop-up over here. Can you see that, or do I need to blow up my screen? Let me blow it up a little bit. Okay.
That looks good.
Okay, so just ultra blown up for demo purposes. So we rate every article on a scale of 1 to 100, being sort of the Factual grade. It's a scaled score. And as I said, over 75, you get a green. We've rated about 10 million articles now over the last 3 years. We have a pretty good base of articles from which to compare and get a sense of how good an article is. The 4 main factors that we look at are embodied in these boxes. And again, very similar to that IFLA infographic, if you remember. So the source itself, how reputable and high quality is it? And I'll get into the details of how we calculate this shortly. The author, how much of an expertise do they have in this topic based on their historical writings? The quality of sources, the evidence cited in this article, how good are they? How rich and extensive are they? How reputable are they? And then the tone of writing, is this written in an inflammatory manner, trying to enrage you, or is it written in a more informative, sort of dry and dull manner? Each of these 4 factors are weighted for articles in different ways, depending on what kind of article it is, if it's a political article, if it's an entertainment article, etc., to result in the score. Now, looking a little bit more deeper, because I think you guys are all quite savvy, you're probably wondering, how is all this calculated? Let's go into details. So the first one we actually calculate is the sources quality. And it looks at how many links and quotes are in this article, and it runs a number of algorithms on it. So on links, it looks at, over here, there are 4 links in this article that are unique. And so you can see who it links to. They link to BBC, and then it links to the ICIJ, which is the organization that had this expose of the Pandora Papers. So only 4 links and only 2 unique organizations. So it's not very extensively researched, which is why the link score, you get a yellow for that. It's not extremely well researched. I'll show you examples of very well researched articles shortly. There's 6 quotes of meaningful length. So we look at the length of quotes, and it has to fit a certain threshold. So you start to get a sense that between the links and the quotes, has this journalist really made an effort to source their material or not? The links, actually, it's a very complex algorithm. It looks at not only how many unique sources, but also which sources you link to and how reputable are those based on historical ratings, and are they across political spectrum, suggesting you really looked at different angles and all kinds of things. So to get a high source rating takes some work to do. The next one we look at is the tone rating. So is the tone of the article itself relatively neutral, or is it inflammatory? One of the very important things that we do is we exclude quotes from this. So you can quote people who are themselves very upset or something like that about an issue, but the journalist maintains sort of neutrality, saying this is what so-and-so said, this is what so-and-so said, but me as a journalist, I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm reporting it down the middle, saying this is what I want. So we get a tone score, and that's a natural language processing algorithm. There's a family of algorithms that are very popular these days that analyze text and can do all sorts of fancy stuff. But one of the things they're very good at saying is sentiment and tone, grammar, all those kinds of things. So it's basically a giant grammar engine, if nothing else. The third thing that we do then is the author's expertise. So what we're looking at here is, has this journalist written on this topic before? And do they write extensively on this topic, maybe exclusively on this topic? And do those previous articles, how do they score for sources and tone? So if a journalist writes consistently on a topic, and they always write stuff that is very well researched and generally neutral, their expertise score starts to climb for that topic. So in this case, for example, Jason Beaubien gets only a medium, because this article is about politics. But if you actually go over here, I'm just going to open this into a new tab, and you can see Jason Beaubien isn't actually a politics reporter. He's NPR's global health correspondent. So in our database, which is now, as I said, we've rated over 10 million articles, about 50,000 journalists, Jason Beaubien probably scores very well for health matters, less so for political news. And so on this article, he didn't have a very high expertise rating for this particular one. And then finally, the quality of the source itself, in this case, NPR. So the average scores of NPR across every article we've ever rated for them, which is probably numbering in the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands at this point. And we let those scores float over time so that it reflects sort of a more recent, like the last 90 to 180 days of ratings. And NPR generally scores well. Again, it's not to say that they don't have a bias. You can see that we still say they're moderately left biased. They do tend to lean a little bit liberal, but on the whole, they tend to try hard to be objective and factual in their reporting. So this article gets a 75, says it's a pretty good one to read. And then we also suggest other articles to read from across the political spectrum. So you can see we suggested one from BBC, which is rated 82%, got a higher rating than this NPR article. And from the right, there's the Washington Examiner, which got an 85% actually, and that's a moderate right leaning publication. So between the BBC and Washington Examiner, or if you picked NPR and Washington Examiner, you get a couple of cuts at this that look pretty informative and highly rated. Between the two, you should be well set on this. That's the core of the algorithm. And as I said, we try to give a lot of the detail here so people can see why an article got a certain rating, rather than just give you a number, 75 or something like that. And just as an example, I'll show you, so this is our news site where we curate all the news that's going on. So we have, this is the factual.com/news. You can see we curate articles, we group them into topic pages, and we show you grades for different articles. So if I show you, we have a section called underreported. People love this. It's articles that are only found on 1 or 2 news sites. You don't find related articles on other sites. So let me go over here to, these are fairly highly rated articles. This one by The Conversation, which is an outlet that actually has a lot of professors write for it. So The Conversation is almost exclusively academics writing. Now academics, they don't tend to have a huge history of publication, which is why there'll be an NA for author grade. But you can see on everything else, they do very well in this case. And this particular article, there were 30 different links on this issue, and you can see it's extensive. I mean, it's Education Week, Climate Integrity, the New York Times, Baltimore Sun, the Washington Post, Climate Crisis, like Census, the US Census, Minneapolis Star Tribune, tons and tons of sources. This person really put some effort into their sources when they wrote this article. They're fairly neutral, and the conversation itself scores highly. So even though we didn't know much about this author, it got a reasonable rating of 81%. What's really nice is that our algorithm was not trained on articles that we thought were good. We didn't start with a set of articles that said, these are the really good articles, and computer learned that. Because if we did, we would bake in our biases. If I had a bunch of articles from the New York Times that I thought were good, then my algorithm is just going to spit out the New York Times every time as a good outlet. Instead, what we said is the defining characteristics of good journalism are really well researched, extensive sources, minimal opinions, and topical focus over and over again. And you can do that without and get a high score without being the Times. In fact, the upshot of it is they're amazing journalists doing really great writing today. Oftentimes it's smaller news outlets that most people don't know about. So just as an example, here's one that's a moderate right-leaning outlet called Reason. It's actually reasonably popular. It's a libertarian site, proudly libertarian, they make no bones about it. And here's something about Biden's China policy, and you can see that this gets a nice score of 79%. It's moderately opinionated, sure, but 17 different links, 3 different quotes. And this is about business, and Eric Bourne writes exclusively on business matters, so he's got a pretty high rating. And so this article tends to be a very good one if you were trying to understand Biden's recently unveiled China policy from a relatively right-leaning pro-business sort of framing and how that looks. The nice thing about this algorithm is it really works across many, many sites, hundreds and thousands of, actually about 2,000 news sources, and finds really great journalism at a lot of these sites. And then to make it easy for folks, because we know that, look, the extension is great if you're a bit of a news geek, to be totally honest, to have something installed and click and see all these. For a lot of people, it's just a lot easier if we give them, sort of curate the best stories and summarize it. So we do that in a couple of ways. We have a website, as I said, which groups the best articles on trending topics. So here's trending topics, Chris and Cinema, of course, about the infrastructure, no surprise there. Pandora Papers, here we go. So we can go to Pandora Papers. You'll see that there are 147 articles on this that have come out in the last couple of days. And we group them by the top rated. This one's 92% from the actual source, something from the left and the right. You can go and see all these articles, and you can sort by bias and grade, publisher, time. You can see a timeline view to understand how the story's been developing, et cetera. We think of this kind of like the Wikipedia page of this topic. If you're interested in the Pandora Papers, this is where you want to go. It's got everything for you. And if all this is still too much, the simplest thing to do is subscribe to the newsletter, which comes out every day, gives you the top 5 topics in US and world news and business, tells you what's important, and gives you a few different viewpoints across the political spectrum. So I rifled through that very fast because I didn't want to make this too much about the factual, but really showing that this was an implementation of all those things that the IFLA and all these sort of healthy media literacy suggestions, and just making it a little bit easier for people to get credible news on important topics every day. So that's the demo. Let me pause now and take questions.
Okay, let's open it up for questions. You can put them in the chat or just jump in. I have a question just to start us off. How have you had to adjust your algorithm over time? And what have you seen kind of as you started that you said this wasn't working and this is something we, because you said here were the criteria, but I imagine that has changed over time, or can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So we sort of built out the algorithm over time. We first just did the sources bit because we wanted to see like that was easy to measure, if you will. And we wanted to see, what did that get us? And then we sort of built it block by block. So we sort of went around those 4 blocks. Some of the changes we made, the tone detection took a while to really perfect. It needed quite some training to really understand the nuance of English grammar. English grammar is not easy. And I feel for everyone that's had to learn English as a second language, like it violates its own grammar rules all the time. So it took a while for us to really train that system and find good data sets to really help it understand what is non-opinionated writing. On expert detection or expert ratings for journalists, it took us a while to figure out what was a good threshold there. 1 article, 5 articles, 10 articles, 20 articles, what really constituted expertise. How much did we allow a journalist to write outside their expert zone? So could you have 1 expert area, 2 expert areas, 3? So we played around with this to really understand what made a beat journalist, in effect, a good journalist. You know, you think of beat journalists as people that really hone in on a topic for a reason. It's complex. And so if you're a beat journalist, you tend to understand a lot of the history and the context. And you can quickly be like, wait a minute, you're saying this, but last year you said this, and this other country does it this way. Why aren't we doing this? You know, you have these facts on hand. So we were trying to find a way to measure that. And it took a while to really hone in on what expertise rating equates to in mathematical measurements, and whether you could have different expertise ratings by different topics and how many different ratings could you hold at a given time. So that took some work to do. And then even the sources one, we've over time realized, like initially we looked for articles from across the political spectrum as being sourced, as an indication that you looked at different viewpoints, at different sort of the arguments for and against something. But that doesn't make sense in all contexts. If you don't have an article that's particularly political, it's kind of silly to ask that. So then we removed that. So then we started to tweak how the ratings were weighted and even what was measured based on the type of article. So an entertainment article has different ratings than a political article has a different rating than a health article, et cetera. So some adjustments like that. So yeah, it's been a work in progress.
Great, thank you. Other questions people have?
Yes, I have a question. How does the consolidation of media impact your rating system? Because we're seeing, you know, small town newspapers getting shrunk and getting eaten up. So how, because it's big money actually is behind a lot of that. So how does that impact this, what you're doing?
Yeah, a couple of things. We don't make any specific considerations or allowances for ownership. So insofar as it doesn't really bake into the system, so I'll talk more peripherally how it affects the ecosystem. You know, the first thing is that in conjunction with local news really struggling and private equity consortiums buying out a lot of them and really siphoning or milking the remaining ad revenue, there's actually a lot of news outlets coming up online, exclusively online. And there's even a movement on local news as newsletters online. So just to give you a few, the Charlotte Ledger, the Palm Springs Post, there's thousands of these where people are realizing that the cost infrastructure or the cost structure and infrastructure of running a print-based establishment or historically bricks and mortar type news org just is very hard to sustain today. And so a lot of them are saying, forget it, shut it down. I'm going to start fresh. And it's just going to be a simple rinky-dink newsletter, but it's going to have great journalism. And so some of the outlets that I mentioned are doing great work. The Charlotte Ledger has a couple of former journalists, actually longtime journalists, and actually same with the Palm Springs Post, longtime journalist there named Mark Talkington, who have decided I'm going to cover my town or my state or city, and I don't need anything. I just need a MailChimp account and or rather these days Substack is probably more common. And that's it. I'm going to run this and I'm going to build my own business around it. And it's early days, but what we're seeing is that some of those folks have really started to get traction from a loyal base of readers. And then with a mix of subscription and ad revenue or donation and ad revenue, they're making it work. So I think there's hope for local news, but it's not going to look the same as the local news that we all knew for the last 40, 50 years, for example. And then directly the actual consolidation, you know, if one conglomerate owns a number of properties, like I said, we ourselves don't make specific considerations for that. What I think is really encouraging is that the internet has allowed so many news outlets to come out. You guys remember that bias chart that I showed, which had like the madness of all those logos. But actually, in some ways, it's a really good thing, because as much as we maybe sometimes yearn for like Walter Cronkite and those days of, oh my God, wasn't it so nice? We all sat around and watched the 6 o'clock news. The truth is, you got very narrow viewpoints. You basically got this and then like a wee bit on either side. But news is really complicated and requires a lot more context, a lot more voices to really fully understand what's going on. And the internet allows that. It's just that it puts a lot of the work on us, the readers. So we need some tools to help us and sort of to level the playing field. But in aggregate, actually, it's great to have a flourishing of a lot of news sources, because we need news sources that challenge each other and challenge our understanding of an issue. Does that answer the question appropriately, Cindy?
Yeah, that helps. Thank you.
I thought it was interesting how you showed that people have been over the years thinking that the media is more and more biased, but yet you show those examples that it's been around forever. So I'm kind of wondering, what are your thoughts on why all of a sudden there's this recognition that there's bias? Is there something, a reason we just didn't care before, or noticing it now because we're more polarized, or maybe we're not as polarized? We were always polarized. I read some things about past elections like that. So
I think there are a couple of things going on. The first, as I said, was that chart of advertising revenue really rising. And as advertising revenue has becomes the lion's share of how news made its money. And again, this is pre-2005, because there was sort of that decline with Google and Facebook. But pre-2005, from 1975 to 2005, advertising was somewhere in the order of 3 to 10 times bigger than circulation revenue. And that really meant that you tended to go in the direction of, I need to capture your attention. I need to have a little bit more explosive headlines, et cetera. So that was one part of the story. The other thing that happened is that when the internet came along and all these thousands of outlets started to flourish, then all these guys realized, wait a minute, we're all fighting for the same attention. How am I going to stand out over you? And so they realized, I need to stake a position that's really clear and different from everyone else. And oftentimes that tended to be on the extremes. I'm going to be really hardcore pro-environment. I'm going to be really hardcore pro-military or something, because if I don't, why would you choose me over everyone else? And so the combination of advertising revenue and a flourishing of thousands of outlets has driven media to indeed become actually more narrow and more sensational. And so I think the public's perception of media being more biased is correct. It has gotten worse over the last 20 or 30 years. But like I said, the good news is there is actually great journalism out there. It's just hard to find. And that's where something like a Factual or some other technology that helps you weed out the good from the bad is so critical. If you see, the Factual at the end can never tell you if something's true or false. That's extraordinarily difficult for a computer to do. It's much easier for a human to do. It's a very nuanced question if something's true or false, actually, when it comes to news. I'm not talking about math or physics. And so what we're trying to do is to say, let's get back to that formula that my dad had 30 years ago. Give me 2 or 3 viewpoints that are moderate, but have different framings and are thoughtful and well-researched and not crazy extremists. And that's it. I can make my own decision. I'll get the last 10% of the way there, but the Factual gets you 90% of the way. You have to do the last 10%. And so, the title of this presentation, Empowering News Consumers, that really is our core thesis, that at the end of the day, it is consumers that are going to make this work. We have to be a smarter reading public. We have to have skepticism. We have to challenge news, apply that rubric from IFLA if we can, or use tools like the Factual, what have you. When we do those things and we use our critical thinking skills, we have a better democracy. We have a much, much stronger democracy than when we just sort of accept, well, Cronkite said this, so it's got to be true. Actually, that's not a good democracy. If you really want to go back to it, in 2000, or when the Iraq War happened, we could very clearly lay a heap of blame on the New York Times as saying, the New York Times came out and said, yeah, there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, for sure. And back then, most people still sort of believed the Times, I think, and said, oh, okay, well, they said it's got to be true. Turns out it wasn't. And really, we should be challenging all this stuff. So I think at the end, the story is we have to be smarter. And I hope that news organizations, at least some of them are doing this, assume that the public is going to be smart enough to reach their own conclusions. And rather than spoon feed us a headline, give us the facts, give us the complexity, and let us reach the right conclusion. My hypothesis, 8 out of 10 people will reach the right conclusion. Forget the 2. There's always one on the left and one on the right that are far gone. But if 8 out of 10 reach it, that's a strong democracy. That works.
This is John. It's very complex, obviously. I'm thinking, I don't know if you watched 60 Minutes last night or the newspaper today, the article that was written about the woman who
Oh, the whistleblower.
yeah, she got the documents from the data from Facebook, and how Facebook continued to slant the news or the stories that were in Facebook anyway. So in fact, Facebook would make more money as opposed to find these untruths, all right?
Mhm.
So in my mind, it's the same problem with corporate media, right? Corporate media's ambition, purpose for existing is to make money. And so if they're not making money, as you said, I mean, the old television notion of if it leads, it bleeds
Yeah.
is now slightly different. It doesn't have to bleed. It just has to get more clicks. So if they can get the clicks and people are, so I don't think corporate media serves us well, but I also know that social media serves us even worse.
Mhm.
And at the same time, journalism schools are hurting for helping create ethical writers, ethical storytellers, ethical, because once they leave the university, they're put in these other environments where they don't have the freedom to tell honest, truthful stories, because just as you said, somebody else is creating the headlines for the click, or somebody else is doing that. I don't think there's an editor sitting at the top, but to some extent, it is truthful that when we had these gatekeepers in the top media, and you use Walter Cronkite for television or whatever, they were at least, to some extent, great extent, I think, doing ethical journalism. And yes, there were exceptions to that rule, but now, just as you showed us the other chart with the multiple media, it's very hard for I'm thinking from a media literacy standpoint, trying to teach people to be critical viewers. Well, how do they do that? Or critical listeners or critical readers? How exactly? Oh, I got to go out and do something else. This is going to drive me crazy. This is going to drive me crazy. I'm just going to go around as a skeptic. I'm just going around critically thinking the world is crazy. So we're in this jumbled mess, and I understand your organization is an attempt to sort of say, at least here, we're going to look at some standards that maybe you can measure. Maybe you could spend the time to do that, but most of us don't have the time to do that.
Correct. Absolutely.
So we're counting on somebody doing that for us.
I think what ends up happening, we've got tens of thousands of readers now on a daily basis. And what we've found is that a lot of folks look at our algorithm once or twice. They're like, what is this green? What's this number? I don't understand this percentage thing. And they dig into it a little bit. And sometimes they see our how it works page. We've got a nice little explainer video for 2 minutes. And they're like, okay, that kind of makes sense. I'm just going to spot check it. And you look at a couple of articles on our site and they're like, yeah, okay, I'm good with this. And then after that, they actually never look at the grade again.
Yeah.
And so I think what we, there's a certain degree of trust that we build up by showing we're so transparent compared to most people, like how we select stories, how we select summaries, how we select topics, even everything. It's very transparent how it works. That builds a lot of trust. People then, once they have built that trust with us, they ease up a little bit. And the format in which we deliver the news is exactly the formula that, like I said, my dad used before, which is there's always 2 or 3 different viewpoints from across the political spectrum. If it's an international story, we try very hard to have a local perspective from that country, because we need to see what people there are also saying, not just what we are saying here. And we curate all this into an email newsletter, as well as the website or in an app. So pick your poison. If you prefer email, because it's probably the simplest, it just comes every day and you can skim it for 5 minutes, you're caught up. If you're more of a web person, great, go to the site. You can skim 1,000 times a day, once a day, whatever you want, once a week. It's always there. If you're an app person, you're always on your phone on the go. We've got that too. We give you a lot of different views and a lot of different reading modalities so that it fits your lifestyle. Even the Chrome extension, that browser extension, it actually surfaces the ratings right in your Facebook and Twitter feed. So as you're scrolling, you'll see the little color indicator saying if this is good or not, and you can click and see the details and suggestions. So the point is, wherever you read, whatever format you read, we will be there, so that we're not trying to change your whole life to be around the factual. We'll be there ready for you. If you want to use us, great. You don't want to use us, that's fine. But in part, we've tried very hard to avoid the pitfalls that I just talked about. So for example, the Factual has no advertising, because if we believe that that's going to lead us down the path of sensationalism, then how hypocritical would it be if we went there as well? So we don't. We have a subscription, and we made it as affordable as we could for every American and everyone in the world. It's $5 a month or $25 a year. Not surprisingly, everyone picks the annual plan because it's cheaper by a long shot. And what's nice about that is we've got subscribers in 5,000 zip codes, in the poorest of places, people who are unemployed, to CEOs reading it. We've got people on the left, we've got people on the right, we've got people that are pastors, we've got ex-convicts. It's insane. And we know this because we have this daily discussion where it really fosters good, healthy discussion on topics with people with different points of view. It's the way we built the discussion. Yeah. It rates quality, not popularity. But that's where people reveal some of these details, which is why we know otherwise the whole thing is quite anonymous. And the upshot of it is, I think corporate news can work, but it has to be designed with good intent in mind. I hope we're doing that. And even then, I would say we're not the be all end all. It's always good to have a mix of news. And every type of news has its pitfalls. If you think nonprofit news or government-sponsored news is good, well, okay, let's take the BBC. Arguably very good, but it is, truth be told, kind of state-run media. How come we're so nice to them, but when you hear about, RT News or some state-run media out of Moscow, we're like, oh, state-run media. Well, do they think that about the BBC? And the BBC has had its issues as well. Nonprofit news, you pick it. We've all got their issues. So really, at the end, I think it's a combination of, I hope more and more journalists and publications write to these metrics that we have, which are in the interest of humans or readers. And then we as readers are always there ready to challenge and be like, yeah, I'm not going to trust any one of you individually. I got to read at least 2 or 3. If we're both doing that, I think we've got a shot.
Thanks.
Great. Any other questions up there? How do you get kids to become news junkies like you? Because I have most kids I know, they think that the news is super boring.
So,
yeah.
It's funny. I did a presentation similar to this one for middle school here in Burlingame at Burlingame Intermediate. And it was grade 7. They had a humanities class. And it was, slightly, it's not so technical in some ways, but very similar. And the kids got it. And I did a survey before to ask them about their news habits, which we then shared sort of the results. They were sharp. They knew what conservative and liberal meant. They knew about bias. Either their parents were talking about it or they sort of had an intuition. It's like, can you really trust that? I think the truth is you're unlikely to be a news junkie unless you're a real geek like I was in school. I think most kids are, it's okay. They probably have better things to do in life than, I don't know, read about political news all the time. But what I was impressed by is that they were sharper and more critically aware than I think we might give them credit for. I don't know what it is. It may be the world they're growing up in. They already have enough horror stories that they get in the news that they sort of have become desensitized that way. But they were smart. They get their news in places that I didn't realize. Instagram, for example, I would, I'm like, isn't that mostly photos? But a lot of them get news there, and people are trying to do good news there. There's some really good accounts there. TikTok, believe it or not, people are doing news on TikTok, and some of the accounts are actually not bad. So I think the truth is there will be quality wherever there's a public. I hope that through teaching in school, the kinds of stuff that you guys are doing, that youth and graduate students grow up with these ideas of media literacy. And if they have that fundamental basis, then I think they're going to do fine. I mean, I had one class on it in grade 9, and a teacher taught us how, an English teacher taught us how to recognize advertising and why and how advertising manipulates you. It was one class in grade 9, and I still remember it today. And it still makes me think about advertising when I think about her class. So I think teachers have a tremendous influence over students, tremendous influence if they're, of course, they're good teachers. And so, yeah, if we do 1 or 2 of these classes, I think for every student coming out of school, we've armed them with the barest of tools. I think they'll do fine, but we have to give them at least some of that training.
That is very hopeful. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm eternally optimistic to a fault. I think you can't be a startup person if you're not. So it drives my wife quite crazy, but yeah.
Any other questions or comments that people want to bring up? Well, I love the pitch at the end for the educational purposes. That's really what we're about here at the Northwest Alliance. We really promote that from all levels, right? So not just in the K through 12, but also higher education in our community in general. And it's just so important. And as you're talking, it really hits home the importance of media for democracy. I mean, it's so important that we have these news sources and that they give us good news so we can make up our decisions. So in our own minds. So thank you for your presentation. And if there's not any other comments, I think we could just wrap up. Do you have any final thoughts, Arjun, before we go?
No, that's it. Thank you so much for having me. I hope the presentation was useful and informative. And for those folks that watch it later, I hope it's not too weird that it was, just like a real conversation. It was actually really fun talking with all of you. So thank you for this opportunity. I'm really, really grateful. And yeah, hopefully we'll collaborate again in the future.
Awesome. All right. Well, good night, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Thanks for everybody's time. And we will be in touch with other good events. Okay, take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.